I've come to sort of appreciate how issues of temporality specifically are especially a problem in coping with different kinds of early colonial artifacts in the context of Brazil. And here I'm showing you just kind of 3 examples, and probably most of you read the article that this is based on today. But here I'm showing you on the screen a Tupinamba feathered cloak from the early 16th century, somewhere in the first 20 years of art. I'm showing you azulejos from the 18th century from Bahia, and an image from Carlos Julião of an Afro-Brazilian woman who's actually wearing a mandinga bag around her waist, which was a very kind of important kind of colonial artifact and object that circulated around the Atlantic world. And in dealing and thinking about the variety, diversity, and abundance of different kinds of material culture in the early 16th and 17th century, these objects, in a way, how do you cope with them as an historian for interpreting or understanding what they mean and how they were made and how we can understand social practice, right? And this is incredibly difficult. So all of these artifacts, in a way, present problems. So for the Tupinamba on the left, we have no written language. We have no period sources the way we would have for other cultures in the Americas in different kinds of ways. We have only 11 artifacts that survive, okay, in the world for featherwork for this particular culture. And those sources are largely written and in a diverse range of European sources and European languages, excuse me. So our access to sort of language is taken down, and the object itself gives us, in a way, the richest source of material we can to approach it. And I'll talk about this with the kind of material analysis I've been doing with these objects. But in a way, the object and an examination of it in its fabrication and its making, in a way, gives us a kind of rich avenue for consideration of what we can make of its meaning and its ritual use and its various contexts that it shifted in and out of, okay? Azulejos are another, problem or issue in the context of Brazil. None of them were ever produced. There were no azulejo workshops in Brazil, for example. All of these azulejos were imported, even if they had a huge impact on building practices in the colonial period. Largely, they were produced in Northern Europe, in the Dutch world, based on Ming porcelain and other sorts of things. So there's all these sort of intercultural crossings that azulejos make to sort of form a kind of visual skin for the making of colonial Brazil. But they themselves, in a way, are bound up with their own kinds of histories. So how do we interpret that when we don't have local artists? We have builders in Brazil, we have artists in Europe, we have narrative strategies that are being lifted from different literary sources across early modern Europe, etc. And then the last sort of consideration for kind of object type that is a problem too in the colonial context are the mandinga bags, which the woman in the upper right is wearing, which were amulet bags that circulated in the Atlantic world from the very beginning of, they existed in some form from the 16th century and have lasted all the way actually through the 20th century in various contexts. But these are largely bags full of efficacious material from across the Atlantic world that in the 18th century, during the slave era, were used as a way to avert harm and avert slavery. They were used, men used them for aid in gambling or for birth control. They had a kind of variety of different uses in a kind of social practice, but largely as a kind of artifact, they're fascinating because in a way they're invisible, right? Their potentiality, like kind of relics or whatever, they're invisible. So the pouch that you see encloses materials that we don't have access to, right? But that kind of have a potent agency inside of them, that kind of efficaciousness. But they turn into a kind of jewelry form in Minas that becomes very popular. It becomes considered an artistic form. And in the 20th century, I'm working currently on a project on the police in Rio, and you find mandinga bags from the 20th century that were used on the city streets in Rio. So there's a kind of longue durée of these. So in a way, none of these artifacts, I feel like, can be stabilized with any sense of periodization or with any kind of fixed sense of kind of geographic area.